Hello. Primeiro, em português, bom dia a todas e todos. É um prazer ter vocês aqui. Infelizmente, as verbas públicas são pequenas, dessa vez a gente não vai ter tradução simultânea, então a partir de agora eu falo inglês. Well, first of all, welcome everyone. Good morning. It is with the greatest pleasure and honor that I inaugurate the fifth colloquium on philosophy of neuroscience. As I want to finish my very short speech in a positive tone, I'll start with the sad notices. First of all, this conference is about decision making. So the first thing we have to, we need to do two homages and express our condolences. The first is, in a conference about decision making, we couldn't avoid to mention that the great Daniel Kahneman died 27th of March. And for anyone in the field of decision making, the Nobel winner Daniel Kahneman is a very important reference, one of our most important references. The other sad notice is about our friend and collaborator, Marcel Bras. His mother-in-law also died this week, so he'll not be able to give his talk. So I want to express our deepest sympathy for the death of his mother-in-law, and also to express our condolences. Now, as a sad notice, exactly today, 60 years ago, we had a military coup in Brazil. So it is also a very sad date for this country. Fortunately, now we live in a democracy again, right? I want to say very brief words about this place. But as you probably know, this is the third Brazilian mint. The first Brazilian mint was in Bahia. Then when the Portuguese expelled the Dutch invaders, the Brazilian mint was taken to Pernambuco, Recife, and then to Rio de Janeiro. But look, that's how things progress. Instead of having a lot of coins and bills in this building, we have something much more important. We have the most important files of this country. And I would say that the social history and memory of a country is much more important than money. So I'm very pleased to have this conference here. We are following a tradition of this meeting to go to historical buildings. Last time, we were at the building that was the first Supreme Court of Brazil. We are discussing agency and responsibility. In the same building, we had our first Supreme Court. Now, we are in a building that is not just an archive, it's the National Archives. It's where the most important memory of this country is taken care of. And these people are very meticulous in the way that they accumulate many documents, from the colonial history to personal histories of immigrants, movements, cultural movements, music, architecture of this country. So I'm very happy to have this venue as a place for this meeting. We're going to have 5 days of a lot of content. Today we start with 2 talks in philosophy, and then we have George Moll that will bring us a flavor of moral decision making and AI and neurosciences. And tomorrow we're going to have a day full of neuroscience. And we're going to be a big mixture of neuroscience, philosophy, and law, right? Renato, if you want to say something, that's the moment, because I have some other homages to do.
I would just like to thank everyone the audience, the students. I'd really like to thank our colleagues, Professor Eddy, Thomas, Peter, and Jennifer, and Stephen, and all the other ones that are not able to be here presently but will be online, and all the organization, all the students that helped us organize this event, and especially Professor Gabriel. And nothing of this would be possible without him. He really did take yeah, he did really take matters into his shoulders, and he did a great job. Thank you very much, Gabriel.
Thank you, Renato, my long-lasting collaborator. That's what I want to do now. Is to the I would say that thanking people, it's part of our obligation here, but I think gratitude is one of the most important values in moral agency. So now I'll proceed. First of all, I want a big round of applause for our keynote speakers. A big round of applause for all invited speakers. I want a big round of applause for the people that are from the supporting committee, like Karina and Mateus. But the most important big round of applause is for Tiago and Bruno, especially Bruno, those two warriors that helped me out as my left and my right arm. Please, a big round of applause for Tiago and Bruno. Okay, so, and of course, we have to thank FAPERJ, which is our supporting agency in the state of Rio de Janeiro, and CAPES, the federal agency that is supporting this meeting, and they made everything possible. Now we already delayed 9 minutes, so I want to introduce you our keynote speaker, Eddy Nahmias. That will, we just made a big round of applause in your helmets. Oh, that's why you came. Ah. You're watching by Zoom, okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it could, I mean, we have a very exciting talker now. Eddy is someone that, whoever is in our field has read his work. And I think what is important in Eddy's work is the relationship between agency, free will, and responsibility. As we are very delayed, I will not go through the very long CV. I just think it will be a pleasure to hear what he has to say in a very interesting combination of subjects. Who has read his abstract knows what I'm talking about. So without further ado, let's receive the professor in the Georgia State University, Eddy Nahmias, please. The word is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I really want to thank the organizers, Gabriel and everybody else, for putting this together. It's a really exciting conference, and I can't wait to hear all the talks. I'm sorry you flew me all the way down here because my talk for today, as the title suggests, is going to be what robots can teach us. So what I did is I asked Claude, which is the robot Anthropic created, the chatbot, a bunch of questions about free will, and it gave me my talk, and I'm just going to read that to you. So I hope you like it. April Fools. All right. Hopefully I'll be better than Claude, but we'll see. I had to do some April Fool's thing. My wife told me I'd be an idiot if not. So my title is a bit of an April Fool's joke because I don't think robots are going to teach us yet about free will. Instead, I'll be considering what we can learn from, should have tested this, yes, our perceptions of free will and our experiences of robots in science fiction. Many philosophers and scientists and most ordinary people think that consciousness is essential for free will. Few tell us why, and when they do, it's often mysterious or unclear what kind of consciousness matters. I'll explore these questions by considering what convinces us that fictional futuristic robots have free will. Eventually, only much later, telling you how I think the answer suggests a plausible theory for why consciousness matters to free will. So I'm very happy to be here in person. And that's what it looks like for those of you who are online. It's beautiful. So here's the plan. I'm going to start by asking my audience some quick questions about what you think about these issues. Then I'll lay out the positions and possibilities on the free will consciousness connection. Part 2 will be exploratory. I'm going to read through something I've been working on potentially for a popular audience that asks us to consider robots as they're presented in films, to consider what flips our switch from seeing them as mere machines to more than machines. This will lead us to that plausible theory of free will and consciousness that I hope you'll find plausible too. I'll highlight some connections between my own theory, my own theory and others, and I'll address some objections, and I'll end with some dilemmas that I'll call anthropic dilemmas that are raised by this view and the possibility of humans trying to build such robots in the future. Gabriel told me I had to speak an hour, so I'll see if I can get all that in an hour and we don't fall further behind in Brazilian time. So let's start with the old-fashioned X-Fi method of polling people by asking them to raise their hands. I can't see what the online votes will look like, but in the audience, I'll ask you to do what I ask my students to do, which is to answer the questions without asking clarification, as if you were reading them in a survey. So I'm not going to smooth out the nuances for you. And second, you have to raise your hand one way or the other, agree or disagree. No sitting on your hands to demand more clarification from me. So first one's real clear, right? Is consciousness necessary for free will? However you understand those concepts, raise your hand. Okay. For those online, we got a lot, and raise your hand, no, it's not necessary for free will. Got just a couple outliers. Everybody else is saying yes, okay. Maybe this will be a little easier and demand less nuance, right? Do dolphins have free will? Raise your hand. Dolphins, got about half, and no, they don't. About a third, and some people are sitting on their hands, even though I told them not to. How about conscious? Are dolphins conscious? Not conscious? Okay, got a few people saying they're not conscious. That's actually surprising to me. What about beetles? Not Paul and Ringo, sorry. Not those beetles. Those beetles. So how many people think beetles are conscious? Raise your hand. Surprisingly, half, and not conscious. Okay, about half and half. How many people think beetles have free will? Nobody, one, maybe. Okay, I'll assume most people don't. It's kind of weird. You can get about half your undergrads probably to say beetles have free will, in my experience. And typically, it's because they think they're conscious or it's correlated. All right, finally, think about futuristic robots. Humanoid ones that look and behave like humans. They pass most Turing tests, but they are programs and they're not biological. So how many of you think they could be conscious? Raise your hand. Such robots, okay? And not conscious. Looks like it's about half and half. How many people think such robots could ever have free will? Raise your hand. And could not have free will. Okay, I'm not keeping track of the correlations here, but I'm guessing there are some. What about, could they be held responsible for what they do, deserve blame for anything they do? Raise your hand for futuristic robots. Really, that's it? And not, they could, wait, let's try that again. How many people think yes, they could be deserving of blame? How many people think no? Okay, maybe a little more than half. All right, so my scientific tabulation is that there's some correlation between attributions of consciousness and free will. I'll ask you just to and I can't see what you said at home for the online audience, but everybody, please just introspect a bit on what you think the connection is, and especially whether you think phenomenal consciousness is what matters, and whether that what it's like feature of experiencing pain or pleasure, sights or sounds, moods and emotions is what matters, or maybe if it's self-consciousness or awareness. Recent experimental philosophy work suggests that it's a mess trying to test these ordinary folks' understanding of free will. Thomas will tell you about that, or consciousness. So luckily, I'm not going to talk much about X-FI research on these topics, but just to bolster the background assumption that there's some correlation between people's attributions of consciousness and free will, here's just one slide from a study I did with my student Corey Allen. We presented participants with short descriptions of one of 24 entities, various animals, robots, corporations, aliens, and various humans. We asked them the degree to which the entity has a range of mental capacities, many more than this, but here there's 3. Being conscious is in blue, being having free will is in green, being morally responsible is in red. And just 6 of the entities: a 4-year-old child, a robot that was described as expressing emotions, a corporation, a dolphin, a woman, and a beetle. And what you can see is that there are typically pretty tight correlations between consciousness and free will across entities. Some of them are surprisingly high, maybe like the child and the dolphin. But what you also see is there can be a disconnect between attributions of free will and responsibility. And I'm going to talk a lot about that, putting pressure on some philosophical theories of free will that define it in terms of moral responsibility. And then you might notice that there are agents that can be considered responsible, like corporations, but not free and not have free will and responsibility, and conversely for some other entities. Like ordinary people, many scientists and philosophers also assume some connection between free will and consciousness. First, and this is a few of many examples. First, there's the scientists, right, who focus on conscious mental processes as essential, and then often say we don't have free will because consciousness isn't playing the right sort of role. I call them illusionists. And here's just 2 examples. Sam Harris saying that free will requires we're the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions. Here's Benjamin Libet, who we'll be hearing about in this conference. There's the consciousness floating above the brain activity down there. But he said one would expect conscious will to appear before or at the outset of the RP and thus command the brain to perform the intended act. And then there's philosophers who respond to the illusionists. People like Al Mealy. Yeah, you can't see his picture. It's a picture of Al who looks more angry than he ever looks in real life because he's a really nice guy. But Al Mealy says, responding to the illusionists, if all our behavior were produced only by non-conscious processes, if conscious decisions were to play no role at all, free will would be in dire straits. Here's some other philosopher, less famous, talking about this. And then we've got Galen Strawson, who says to be responsible for our principles of choice, we must consciously choose our principles. Randy Clark, free will requires a capacity for rational self-determination. A free agent must be able to exercise that capacity consciously. There are many others who reference the importance of consciousness, and those would include libertarians, who I haven't really put up here, although Randy and Al both have libertarian theories. But whether they're naturalist libertarians like Robert Kane, or agent causationists, or Mysterians like Noam Chomsky and Colin McGinn, they typically talk about consciousness being important. And then you've got the ones who think the mystery of free will can be solved by the mystery of consciousness, which can be solved by the mystery of quantum physics, as if one mystery can solve another, like Penrose and Hodgson and Hameroff. Indeed, despite the free will consciousness connection being so pervasive, it's typically left mysterious, implicit, or asserted without much defense or explanation. I searched about 40 books on free will and typically there's a kind of dead space, or we'll call it a zombie zone, where consciousness would appear between compatibilism and the consequence argument. And awareness and self-consciousness don't show up much either. Qualia and phenomenal consciousness almost never. Here's Greg Caruso pointing out the need to fill this gap. Clarifying the relationship is imperative if we want to evaluate the various arguments. For instance, do compatibilist reasons responsive and deep self accounts require consciousness? And then a libertarian, Tim O'Connor, says something the philosopher ought to be able to provide is some light on how consciousness figures into the equation. One has the impression that an intelligent automata, a robot, could conceivably satisfy the conditions set by these accounts, something that's very counterintuitive. So we see from just these ideas that consciousness may be considered to be contingently related or indirectly related to free will, or just along for the ride. And what do I mean by that? I mean, free will can be theorized and is theorized as requiring some capacity X, right? Whether it's self-control, reasons responsiveness, higher order desires or values, the things deep self theorists talk about. And then we can ask, and we could ask the same thing about libertarian capacities like agent causal powers or indeterminism. We can ask whether or not consciousness is required for capacity X, and in what sense. Is it constitutive? Is it conceptual? Is it nomological? Or is it more contingent, just happens to be instantiated in humans and maybe some other animals, such that when we have that capacity, we have consciousness? But it seems that, first of all, for humans, we can certainly exercise the capacities automatically without consciousness. I can give this talk without being conscious of what I'm going to say before saying it. I can be reasons responsive when I answer your questions without being conscious of what I'm going to say or why I'm saying it before I say it. And we can all do that for many complicated activities. We could act on our values and on the will we want to motivate us in Frankfurt's sense without being conscious of the higher order of volitions. And Frankfurt explicitly thought that. Now, we might still think, but it at least requires creature consciousness, right? It requires that the agent be the sort of agent that can sometimes be conscious and sometimes have these mental states consciously. But then we have to ask whether phenomenal consciousness is what matters, or more often, something that might be tied to what Ned Block called access consciousness, right? The awareness or representation of relevant mental states, and not necessarily phenomenal consciousness or the qualitative experiences we have when we taste a lemon or feel sorrow or have an orgasm, right? And one way to see that point is to consider whether or not other complex cognitive creatures, such as robots or aliens, could have the relevant capacity X, but without any conscious experiences. That is, can they demonstrate the capacities, higher order volitions, reasons responsiveness, deliberation, while being, quote, dark on the inside? Nothing it's like to be such an entity. Some theorists have offered robots as a way of demonstrating precisely their view that phenomenal consciousness is not required for free will. Dan Dennett, in his great book Elbow Room, wrote, "Our imagined non-conscious creatures, robots he's talking about, would be equally able to engage in rational self-deliberation. They could react appropriately to reasons. Isn't that what freedom hinges on, whether or not it amounts to consciousness?" Much more recently, Christian List says, "My analysis works only if I assume the issue of free will is separate from the issue of phenomenal consciousness," but he sees no conceptual problem with that, attributing free will to an agent that lacks phenomenal consciousness like corporations or other group agents, or perhaps some kinds of AI systems. I think this move of making, assertions about free will without phenomenal consciousness fits well with recent trends in the philosophical debate that identify free will with the control capacities that are the highest level sufficient for moral responsibility or basic desert, right? To use Dirk Peribin's example or definition. Free will refers to what's required for basic desert. Most philosophers on all sides of the debate now seem to accept this sort of top-down method of picking out the relevant concept of free will. In this vein, Neil Levy, who argues that a type of consciousness is required for moral responsibility, but he focuses on access consciousness for some of the facts that give our actions moral significance. He says explicitly, phenomenal consciousness might be necessary for being a moral patient, but not a moral agent. For him, like List and Dennett, robots are philosophical zombies that have the relevant reasons responsive capacities, could have free will with no conscious experiences while being completely dark on the inside. That view might work for some types of analyses of responsible agency, but I think O'Connor is right that this view is highly counterintuitive, and I think the X-FI research suggests that it's counterintuitive to most people, that it comes with a potential cost of biting a very hard bullet. And it's a bullet I want to avoid biting if I can, if we can find some plausible connection between free will and consciousness. And I want to try to find one that is less contingent, more direct, more conceptual. So to do so, I'll be asking us to consider our responses to fictional robots. And I'm going to shift gears now to just read through a piece that's aimed for a general audience, drawing on these examples from movies and TV, examples I hope you're familiar with. If not, then you need to get out more, or maybe stay in more, watch more streaming services. Before I begin, though, I just want to offer this quote from Samuel Scheffler, who uses it in the context of his theorizing about what matters to us and our reactions to thought experiments in which we imagine the end of the human race in a few generations from now. He focuses on the fiction Children of Men to draw out these intuitions about doomsday scenarios. And he argues that when we think about such scenarios, we realize we care deeply, not so much about our individual survival, but about the survival of human culture and enterprises like philosophy and science. And after all, unless we cared about the collective afterlife, why would we work so hard on endeavors that we know can't be completed in our own lifetime? Some people don't share these intuitions. But he writes, when I talk about our attitudes and what we think or feel, I don't mean to be making strictly universal claims. I mean to be characterizing my own attitudes and the attitudes of any other people who share them. Or to borrow some terminology David Lewis employed, how much am I claiming? As much as I can get away with. So with that in mind, let's see how your reactions compare with mine to fictional robots and see how much I can get away with. When we watch Westworld or Blade Runner or Ex Machina or many other portrayals of futuristic robots, we feel a tension within us. We know the robots are programmed, inorganic, non-human machines, but as the plot unfolds, we also start to experience some of them as almost human, as creatures who are able to think and feel on their own. At some point in the story, their portrayal starts to make us think of these robots not as automatons, but as autonomous, able to make decisions and control their own behavior. We begin to see them as agents with free will, who may be responsible for their own behavior. We may even admire their good behavior and resent their bad behavior. We begin to see them as persons, not mere programs. So what spark do we see in these robots that flips the switch so that we see them as more than mere machines? By considering that question, I think we can learn a lot about our own free will and responsibility. And I think the answer is both obvious and surprising. Surprising in that it's rarely mentioned or developed in the elaborate theories of philosophers and scientists. Obvious because the science fiction creators and their audiences seem to have known it all along, if only implicitly. Maybe some of you have already thought of it. Let's consider some of the answers I think are tempting but lead us astray. First, in the examples I started with, and with most others, from the synths in AMC's series Humans, which is really interesting if you haven't seen it, to David in AI, to Ash in Alien, Alfie in this new movie Creator, which isn't that great, but there you go. The robots are portrayed by human actors who look and behave much like humans. So it might just be that we see them as persons just to the extent we forget or lose track of their android nature and experience them as biological humans playing characters on the screen. But of course, we don't experience many other humans portraying mindless robots as persons if they're robotic. Consider the blue-eyed synths in Aliens, or the robots in iRobot, or the many mindless robots in Westworld and other fiction. You can test your reactions to see if you care when these robot characters are killed, as so many are in Westworld. Here they are being massacred. If you think of them as mindless machines, you don't really seem to care, and that's my reaction to at least some of them. And furthermore, we don't need robots to look human for us to experience them as incipient persons. Consider WALL-E or R2-D2, or the disembodied AI programs HAL in 2001, or Samantha in Her. Have y'all seen these things? Mostly. Some people are nodding their heads. All right. We're responding to features of the robot's expressions and behaviors, not just their human form. We might also get a clue from our feelings about aliens who don't look human, but over the course of the story, we increasingly experience as persons. E.T., or the aliens in Arrival who don't look human at all, or the many extraterrestrials in Star Trek, Star Wars, etc. Now, it is easier to see them as persons when they look and act humanish. Two big eyes always help. But we're not so stingy with our attributions of free will and personhood that we require a human or humanoid body. It does seem easier to experience them as persons if they're living, aliens or cyborgs or robots who seem organic because they're fleshy and bleed like the ones in Westworld. So maybe seeing them as alive is important, although I think seeing them as mortal will be more important. It may also be that we're apt to see certain embodied living creatures as having a soul, and maybe that's the crucial thing that we need to see them as having a free will. But that just relabels the question. Why would we see them as having a soul? And souls need not be laden with metaphysical or religious requirements, an immaterial entity attached to a body during life, but that can exit the body and exist in the afterlife. After all, we don't see these unseeable entities portrayed on the screen. I don't have any pictures to show you of the robot souls. And it seems unlikely that at the point where the switch flips for us, we theorize that the robot has literally gained an immaterial soul, or its soul has been turned on, whatever that might mean. So whether people think of the robot or aliens in question as having a soul or just having soul, it would be in virtue of seeing them as embodying some particular qualities. Which qualities? Well, the same ones we're searching for here, as we try to understand why we see some robots as persons with free will. So this excursion into talk of souls and biological bodies seems to have distracted us. But as promised, I think it helps us learn something about our own understanding of human free will. The essence of free will is not to be found in some metaphysical substance or entity, such as a body or soul. It's to be found in some features or functions that we typically associate with bodies and souls in humans and perhaps animals, because that's the only form we experience them in the real world, except when we have these fictional excursions. So our attribution to robots and aliens would be evidence for the idea that we see persons with free will as a matter of function, not form. Of course, that suggests a theory closely tied up with the history of artificial intelligence, the functionalist theory of mind. That theory says mental processes should be understood in terms of information processing, regardless of whether it's carried out in a human brain or an animal brain or an alien brain or a complex computer or a futuristic robot. It argues that minds are multiply realizable, right? A functionalist theory of mind and free will is on the right track, but if we follow the functionalist paradigm of artificial intelligence, I think we'll be led down the wrong branch of that track. Because artificial intelligence leads us to think of intelligence, of sophisticated computers that can play chess or Jeopardy or Go, or deep learning programs that can detect faces, drive cars, and now support chatbots that have sophisticated conversations with us. The original Turing test, of course, was to test whether computers can think, was based on whether they could converse with us in a way that made us believe it was another human. But we typically don't think that these merely intelligent computer programs are persons with free will, even if they have sophisticated and intelligent conversations with us, if the content of those conversations expresses mere intelligence or rationality. And even if it's expressed with the chatbot's perfect syntax and form that's better than most humans, or at least human students, right? We start to feel more confused when the chatbots start displaying the very features that all suggest we see in fictional robots that flip our switch. But indeed, we can imagine very sophisticated machines that meet the criteria of one of the more influential theories of free will and responsibility that I don't think would lead most of us to attribute free will. That's the reasons responsive theory of John Martin Fisher that says an agent has free will of the sort required to be morally responsible if it has the capacities to regulate its behavior according to what reasons it has for action. A robot could be reasons responsive, yet still seem to lack free will. It may even act according to moral reasons. For instance, we may be able to build autonomous weapons systems that follow moral rules of war at least as well as human soldiers. We might even hold them accountable rather than their programmers when they make mistakes. Marcus Neer is doing some cool studies that suggest that's the case. We might design robots to serve as teachers, stock traders, nurses that can recognize and respond to moral, professional, pragmatic reasons, at least as well as humans. Walter may tell us more about this later this week. But I think few people would attribute free will to them based solely on these reasons responsive capacities. Even if they were learning machines that changed their behavior through individual experiences and learn new reasons to make decisions, I predict most people would still see them as complicated programs rather than persons, at least until they gain that final ingredient we're still searching for. Our reactions here seem to parallel our reactions to corporations. We readily hold corporations such as Google, Exxon, JP Morgan to be blameworthy and sometimes legally responsible for the bad things they do. Maybe praiseworthy for good things they do, that seems less common. We do this even if we don't know which, if any, individual humans are responsible for those outcomes. In fact, there may not be any specific individuals who are responsible, since the decision-making of corporations is distributed and complex. Yet a distributed decision-making collective can arguably respond to reasons. And that may explain why we're willing to blame and legally punish them for bad decisions. That's why Christian List says corporations and robots could have free will because they satisfy his higher order agential capacities that he picks out for free will. But few of us, I think, are gonna attribute to corporations or other collective entities free will, or being persons in the sense I'm using the term here. That is, persons not like the ones Mitt Romney meant when he said, corporations are people, my friend. Corporations seem to lack what artificial intelligence might lack in the future. What is it? Well, an obvious answer, phenomenal consciousness. There's something it's like to be a human or a dog or a bat experiencing the world. There's nothing it's like to be a corporation or a complicated computer program playing chess or driving a car for Tesla or spitting out text for a chatbot. Okay, but that just leads us back to the question I started us off with. Why would consciousness be essential? And what sorts of consciousness would lead us to think of a robot or other entity as a person? Most of us probably think that fish and maybe beetles and certainly birds and mammals are conscious of the sights and sounds they experience. They have sensory consciousness. But again, I don't think that's quite enough to make us think of the animals as having free will when we think that way. Maybe we just need to combine sensory consciousness with the requisite level of intelligence or self-awareness to get to personhood. But once again, I think robots can see this answer doesn't quite get us there either. Some robots in fiction are presented as highly intelligent, but also able to have sensory experiences of the world around them. We take them to see and hear, and they seem self-aware in some sense of the term, but I still think they're missing something crucial. Consider the robotic sense in humans, or the ones in iRobot, or the T-1000 robot in Terminator 3, or maybe even the Sentinels in the Matrix. I experience them as having some sort of sensory consciousness of the world around them, and as being highly intelligent and making decisions, but they don't flip my switch. Do they flip yours? I won't take a poll, but you can think about it. As a side note, our studies and Justin Sisma's suggest that people are willing to attribute to robots the ability to experience sights and sounds, see colors, and be intelligent at a higher rate than the ability to have free will or to have the specific types of conscious experience I'm going to focus on very shortly. I know I've been playing coy for a long time, but just to point us towards that answer, let's watch 3 short clips of robots in films. If it works, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. See if it'll let you play. This is Dolores from Westworld, if you can hear it.
My parents. They hurt them.
Limit your emotional affect, please.
Spoiler alert, they're both robots.
What happened next?
Then they killed them. And then I ran. Everyone I cared about is gone. And it hurts. So badly.
I can make that feeling go away if you like.
Why would I want that? The pain? They're lost. It's all I have left of them. You think the grief will make you smaller and sad, like your heart will collapse in on itself, but it doesn't. I feel spaces opening up inside of me, like a building with rooms I've never explored.
Okay, see if the next one will work. This is Agent Smith from The Matrix. So it can be bad guys who allow us to do this. Is it going to let you advance? Try hitting escape and going back in.
Can you hear me, Morpheus? I'm going to be honest with you. I hate this place, this zoo, this prison, this reality, whatever you want to call it. I can't stand it any longer. It's the smell, if there is such a thing. I feel saturated by it. I can taste your stink. And every time I do, I fear that I've somehow been infected by it. It's repulsive, isn't it? I must get out of here. I must get free. And in this mind is the key, my key. Once Zion is destroyed, there is no need for me to be here. Do you understand? I need the codes. I have to get inside Zion. And you have to tell me how. You're going to tell me, or you're going to die.
Okay, that little light. Let's lighten the mood a little bit. If we can get the next one, Wally. That's Eve on the right. If you haven't That was a robot kiss. All right. When I asked my daughter, who happens to be named Eve, whether she thought of Wally as conscious and having free will, when she watched the movie, she said yes, because he clearly cares about Eva and the planet. Indeed, Eve hit the target that I've been aiming us towards, and that these clips illuminate, I believe. Suffering, anger, love. It's such emotions that matter for whether we see the robots as having free will. Why would conscious experiences associated with emotions matter, and what sort of emotions? When we see robots as experiencing feelings of sadness, remorse, happiness, fear, and joy, we automatically attribute to them a capacity to care about what happens to them. An agent experiences positive emotions like joy when the goals or people they care about are doing well, like Wally and Eve, and negative emotions like fear and pain are what they feel when their goals or the people they care about are threatened or thwarted, like Dolores and Agent Smith. I believe that when we watch robots on the screen, the switch is flipped most fully when we see them express love for others, or when they recognize, remember, or fear the death of their loved ones or of themselves, as in Blade Runner's Replicants, or those robots in Westworld who achieve personhood, or Ava from Ex Machina. And the dimmer switch seems to turn up in proportion to the degree that we see the robots or aliens or animals as capable of experiencing increasingly profound suffering or pleasure or joy. These conscious feelings and emotions are constitutive of the capacity to care. For an entity without the capacity to care, nothing really matters. And no matter how intelligent, sophisticated, or rational such an entity is, it does not seem to be a person with free will if nothing really matters to it. It can be motivated to act, but not moved to act. It can deliberate about which option to pursue, but not feel the consequences of those options. It may sense the world around it and carry out immensely complicated tasks, but it seems merely to be going through the motions. Conversely, once robots express the emotions that lead us to see them as caring, we see their decisions as mattering for them. The experience of anxiety that necessarily attends the uncertainty about whether their decisions will turn out to help or hurt what matters to them. They experience the happiness of decisions that help and the suffering of decisions that hurt the goals or people they care about. At that point, do we thereby see them as having a metaphysical power to overcome or even transcend their programming? Perhaps some people see it that way. I'm more inclined to think that we begin to see them as we see each other, as having been thrown into the world with initial programming, in our case, our nature and nurture, to begin to learn on our own and discover what matters to us. The robots we see as persons already had in place the capacities to perceive the world and reason about how to achieve goals, but now they have goals of their own, internalized as the objects of their fundamental cares, of what really matters for them. Typically in the movies, one of the things they begin to care about is their own freedom, that is, being able to pursue what they've come to care about, regardless of what their designers have in mind for them. And of course, that's what typically generates the drama. But it's not just that they act in ways their designers didn't predict or don't directly control. That can occur with non-conscious robots. Sometimes that happens in the fiction. They do what they're not programmed to because they become hyper-intelligent or break down. But transcending their programs in these unpredictable ways doesn't seem to be sufficient to flip the switch unless they also care. We can and should ask whether caring, mattering, even emotions require conscious experience. Some philosophical and psychological theories of motivation and emotion dispense with any reference to internal qualitative features or suggest those features are causally or conceptually irrelevant to the functional states that cause behavior. At this point, I can only ask you to introspect on your own experiences of other persons, including fictional robots that you experience that way. Can you experience them as literally dark on the inside when they express emotional states that are bound up with what seems to matter to them, their fear or anger or suffering at losing what they care about, their joy or pride at achieving what they care about? When philosophers like David Chalmers ask us to imagine philosophical zombies, I find it unimaginable when watching these sorts of movies. Try to imagine the end of a film where you're convinced the robot desperately desires not to die or to protect another person from dying, but you're also convinced the robot is not conscious at all. It seems difficult, if not impossible, to do. Less dramatically, I imagine a robot with free will when I imagine it like me, restlessly stirring in the middle of the night as it worries about how to make the right decisions the next day, or as it considers how its cares conflict with each other and how what it decides to do can only support one of their cares and not the other. Given that we don't know what decisions such robots with free will might make, we might stay awake at night ourselves, worrying about whether to try to create them. So that's the end of part 2. I'd love to hear later your feedback of whether you thought that excursion through sci-fi is a useful way to consider these issues, but Gabriel told me to spend an hour, so I'm going to spend another 15, 20 minutes. No, I have more. I want to spend another 15, 20 minutes. Okay. Yep, I know. I'm cutting into my questions. I thought I had 2 hours, but I want to get back to more philosophical presentations of the information. Huh? Yeah, I'm trying to avoid the questions. But here's the outcome of this excursion, right? Laid out in a way that we're used to looking at, right? That what's essential to free will on this account that I find plausible is that things can matter to the agent. So free will requires the capacity to care for such that the outcomes of those decisions matter for the agent. And I'm suggesting it's constitutive of caring that one has relevant affective and emotional responses to the objects and outcomes of one's cares, including experiences of pain, pleasure, frustration, suffering, joy, anxiety, and more sophisticated agents that are social, ones that are tied to Peter Strawson's reactive attitudes, such as regret, pride, resentment, gratitude, very important emotion, and so on. And finally, it's plausible that the capacity to experience these affective and emotional states requires phenomenal consciousness. So I'm sure many of you are having the standard reaction to philosophy talks now. Oh yeah? You can queue up your objections to each of the purported relationships, right? You can suggest that, you might suggest that one can have emotions without phenomenal consciousness, that the proper definition of emotions doesn't require any reference to the phenomenal states, that the functional rules of causing eruptive responses to relevant stimuli, or however you want to define emotions, could be stripped off. You could strip off the conscious pain, pleasure, and other phenomenal and affective states. I personally think that that view is the result of being in the grip of a sort of dualist view that makes zombies coherently imaginable, with the conscious feelings as epiphenomenal side effects that can be stripped off their functional foundations. And my excursion into our reactions to science fiction robots was supposed to help us see how unimaginable such zombies are, at least when we see them suffer, fear, and mourn about the objects of their cares. So I'm going to side with the emotion theorists who define emotions in part, who define the emotions in part in terms of their affective and phenomenological states. Now, it's true that creature consciousness is what's going to matter here, since, of course, cares and emotions can be considered dispositions to motivate relevant behavior without episodes of them being experienced at a given time. A father who loses a child need not feel sorrow all the time when he's experiencing grief. But to say that he experiences grief while never feeling sorrow seems contradictory, or an indication that he did not actually care about his child. My response is going to be similar to the claims that caring doesn't require any affective states or emotions. Here I'm even more confident about the constitutive and conceptual connections. We could build robots that are motivated to achieve goals, perhaps even goals they develop on their own, and to express emotion-like responses when their goals are achieved or thwarted. And we will build such robots to be care bots or artificial lovers. But if the robot is behaving based on functions that include no conscious experiences, I am comfortable asserting that we should use quotation marks and say the chess program only cares about winning and Replica only seems to care about the people that love their robot lovers. And that, of course, is going to raise a dilemma about the fact that some people do anthropomorphize their lovers, their robot lovers in that way. But again, let me just remind you briefly of my response to the other standard philosophical response, so what, right? Some of you might wonder why I had to take us through this excursion through sci-fi to make an obvious or uninteresting point that, yeah, sure, some sense of caring and emotions is important for free will, at least in humans. And if they're so obviously relevant to ordinary people and sci-fi writers, they must be somehow implicit in philosophical theories. But again, I remind you that they're almost never explicitly discussed, these connections, by philosophical or scientific theories, and they're sometimes explicitly rejected, like those people who I pointed out say that phenomenal consciousness is not required for free will. Again, I think that's largely a result of our philosophical focus on the capacities required for moral responsibility, and that top-down approach that focuses on rational deliberation, reason's responsiveness, does make it seem like the functional roles could be carried out by robots or other creatures, maybe even corporations, that lack phenomenal consciousness. And even when theorists, including libertarians, mention consciousness, they rarely explain why phenomenal consciousness matters. There are only a few philosophers who make an explicit connection, and so these are sort of the progenitors of the theory that I'm trying to suggest is not just intuitive, but also plausible. We can go back, of course, to Peter Strawson, who said that free will and responsibility are tied to our capacities to express and modify our reactive attitudes, such as guilt and gratitude. If one takes the view that those reactive attitudes are constituted in part by their phenomenal experiences, then his account and other deep self accounts that are inspired by him do make this essential connection between conscious experience and freedom and responsibility. And of course, he also emphasized how much we care about how others treat us, and that the reactive emotions are responses to expressions of care, and whether or not the other agents show a lack of respect for social norms. Harry Frankfurt moved from his higher order account of free will towards a self-expressive account in his later work, and he explicitly discussed the importance of caring and love for free will and responsible agency. Jaworska develops these ideas nicely as well, as do Chandra Shapada and David Shoemaker, who develop Frankfurt's account and also emphasize the role of emotions in caring. Shapada says caring is associated with a rich and distinctive profile of emotional responses, finely tuned to the fortunes of the things that are the objects of the care, and he identifies our deep self with our cares. And David Shoemaker writes, the relation between cares and affective states is extremely tight. The emotions we have make us the agents we are. Freedom consists in both the necessitation stemming from care and one's reflective awareness of such necessitation. So in response to the so what objection, I suggest my claim that there's a free will consciousness connection that goes through caring is neglected by most theorists, and it needs further development. And the self-expression theorists haven't gotten enough attention, in part because of this focus on moral responsibility. If anyone knows of theorists I'm missing in this ballpark, please let me know. I hear tell Heidegger has some stuff to say in this area.
A little bit Dreyfus.
And Dreyfus, exactly. So I'm going to go look at their stuff more closely. Now, there are lots of other objections for me to consider, including methodological ones that suggest I'm depending too heavily on a sort of anthropocentric focus on human free will and human intuitions. I think we should care about those intuitions and that type of free will, but I'll leave it to discussion to talk about. And then there are a bunch of dilemmas that I was going to raise, but maybe I will stop and see if we have time to go back to them. But they're all about the fact that we do anthropomorphize, right? We do assume that Wall-E and the robots in the movies have emotions, even though they don't, right? The things on the screen don't, and if they're actors portraying humans, they're portraying the emotions very well, and they're not actually robots. And the same thing's going to happen with Claude and Replica. I can give you some. I can tell you about some interesting experiments that Eyal Aharoni and Walter Sennett Armstrong and a group and me did on the moral Turing test and Claude's ability to pass it already. And I have some interesting discussion of Claude defending himself in a trial that I put him on for murder, where he completely convinces me that he sounds like he cares about, whatever you want to call Claude, cares about the outcome of the trial and whether he's considered a person or not. We're going to have to escape the anthropomorphic trap, probably by looking inside the programs to see how they work and seeing whether they carry out whatever we take to be our best theoretical understanding of the relevant functions. And that leads us to a big dilemma that I will just put up here instead of talking through it, to figure out if we try to build these sorts of robots, are they just bullshitters like Claude? Are they actually having the relevant mental states or not? Anthropic is going to try to build them for care bots or lovers at some point. And at some point, they'll probably try to replicate whatever we think are the relevant programs in us that carry out consciousness, whether it's IIT or global workspace or attentional theories or whatever. But we're going to be unsure about whether or not that's the right theory or even whether functionalism is true. So we're going to have some theorists who think, yep, we're creating conscious persons. And we're going to have some, the skeptics, who think that's the wrong theory of consciousness, or they're going to be like John Searle and think no program can run whatever is needed to have consciousness and understanding. So the robots are going to be empty shells despite appearances. And that leads us to Schwitzgebel's moral dilemma for future robots. So I'll just leave it up here. But it's basically the dilemma of we're not going to know which camp is right. If Camp Conscious is right, the robots will deserve full human rights, not to be slaves. We might have to protect them and educate them. If Camp Skeptic is right, they don't deserve rights. They can be treated like any other property. If Conscious is right, but we act as if Skeptic is right, we'll be violating the rights of many persons, causing great harm. Of course, that's what we're going to do. That's what all the movies are about. But maybe there'll be a robot rights movement that's more successful than the animal rights movement at some point. But then, if Skeptic is actually right, but we act as if Conscious is right, we're going to harm humans because we're going to give resources and protections to these empty shells. And it's going to happen. It's already happened with the amount of energy we spend for these artificial intelligence. So we're going to have moral catastrophe one way or the other. So what should we do? Well, I think Schwitzgebel's right that we shouldn't build any robots with disputable moral status. But of course, that's not going to happen. We can't even have a 6-month pause on the chatbots. So we're going to have to face this dilemma. Ideally, we would be able to figure out what the underlying structures are that support genuine phenomenal consciousness and caring, because for me, that's going to be essential for understanding them as persons with free will. But to end on one last pessimistic, optimistic dilemma, and bring it back to our dinner discussion yesterday, we're going to be gone before too long because we're made of meat, we're fragile. So maybe we'll build robots that can be persons who can last longer than us. And maybe they can carry on human culture, if you care about that sort of thing, into the collective afterlife, maybe even to other civilizations, if any exist. And they might be able to bring to those civilizations human culture. But with that, I'll end and thank you for what I hope was your conscious attention.
Well, now we have time for questions. Normally, it's not the most elegant thing the host, the main organizer, start asking, but I simply don't care, because I mean, there's something I can really contribute in this subject. Yeah, we already mentioned Heidegger and Hubert Dreyfus. Hubert Dreyfus was my professor at Berkeley. So I mean, 1972, or What Machines Can Do, his book, is exactly applying the categories of the analysis of the design to say that machines in general, robots or computers, are unable to have any sort of agency, exactly because they don't have care. In Heidegger's technical vocabulary, it's Sorge in German, Sorge, care. So that's exactly, I mean, the thesis you're somehow defending here is very, very similar to the one Hubert Dreyfus defended in 1972. Those who doesn't care with their existential project cannot have planning, and they cannot have this dimension of, I mean, I don't even know if Heidegger believed in free will. I wouldn't say that. I would say that he has some elbow room for the way you're defined by the surrounding world, the Umwelt in German. But at the same time, if you get all the design grammar that Heidegger establishes, he also pays attention to the same point that you did, that what they call in German Stimmungen, that sometimes people translate as humor, but word by word would be tuning. You have a certain affination, a certain tuning. There is your psychological, affective relationship to a certain cause, to a certain process, to a certain event. So I think all the grammar that Hubert Dreyfus take land from Heidegger and applies to artificial intelligence is very aligned with what you're saying. But what you're saying is based on some X-Fi, let us say, approach to it, and taking stock of our, let us say, popular views on artificial intelligence, our current popular views. So I just want to explore a little bit those relationships. Now, I mean, because somehow we get into very close conclusions from what he, exactly as he stated in 1972. That's my question. And who's next?
Well,
Thomas.
I'll just say thank you for the reminder, and that is going to be exactly what I explore next, and I'll be interested to see how much I can draw from that. And then I think for a philosophical paper, I'll focus or maybe there'll be several papers here, but I'll focus partially on emphasizing that somehow the free will literature got lost from this view and this connection when it started thinking about capacities that so clearly seem to be able to be carried out without caring, without cares, without phenomenal consciousness. So thank you. Oh, and I just want to say, the X-Fi literature, I mean, I hope the excursion through sci-fi helps remind us what existentialists certainly knew, which is one of the best ways to explore our philosophical intuitions is with fiction. And sometimes the fiction writers are much better than philosophers at drawing out the right thought experiments. All right, Thomas.
So I just wanted to pick up on what I wrote down, and you got to the slide that you're going to leave it here on the anthropomorphizing stuff. And I'm not sure, I mean, it depends on what you mean by anthropomorphize, but I think it's not what we're doing in this case. So like people accuse those of us who might over-attribute in their eyes to non-human animals a lot of our characteristics and dispositions, and they say that we're anthropomorphizing, meaning I truly believe that they have those properties, and I'm mistaken in believing that they have those properties, and I believe it for a faulty set of reasoning, right? But I don't think that's what's happening when I watch cartoons or fiction. Instead, I temporarily suspend disbelief. I'm overlaying this entire human frame on top of them, and then I'm treating them as if they have these things. But of course, if you ask me, do cartoon characters have minds? No. Are they reasons responsive? No. But they are representations of reasons responsive things that have minds, so on and so forth. So I just don't know that what we're doing is what you would normally call anthropomorphizing rather than this other thing. Now I take it you'll just say, yeah, but the reason we do that is because that's the way so the way to get us to care about free will is to do that overlaying.
Yeah, the overlay, I mean, I think what we're overlaying is our implicit theories about all this stuff. So that's precisely what the fiction writers are doing so well when they get us to suspend our disbelief. But it also is what helps illuminate the underlying theories that we have. But the dilemma that I didn't spell out clearly enough or fully enough because of lack of time is the dilemma that, of course, we do know in the case of cartoons that we're overlaying these things onto things that don't actually have the relevant mental states. We're going to do that. We do that with Claude and Replica and the AI already. So I think we're going to need to also develop the technical, philosophical, neurobiological theories that are good enough to allow us to look inside to see, like, are they carrying out what we genuinely think is required to have the things that we intuitively attribute to them? And if the answer is no, or we don't know, then I think it's going to be really tricky what we do ethically. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I have an answer, a question, sorry, not an answer.
I'm looking for answers
too. Well, the question concerning about your notion of caring. Your notion of caring is also anthrocentric. Do you want to keep that sense of caring about another human being and caring about ideals? Or, for example, the minimal sense in which we care about the preservation of our life and body will be enough for you to attribute free will to an entity? And I was thinking about the beetle and ants that in certain way they care in that minimal sense, and then maybe they can take certain sort of decisions. And the other question was, do you conceive that maybe free will is I don't know if it is a capacity, how to call it, but at least it can come in degrees, or it's a nothing or all phenomenon? What is
right? So second question is, does it come in degrees? And the answer is yes. And what's tricky, and you know, my own analysis hasn't cared about caring and consciousness until recently, when I started thinking about this view. It was all about relevant cognitive capacities, like the capacity to imagine alternatives, the capacity to control behavior in the right sort of way, things that I think you could do without consciousness. And all those capacities, I think, come in degrees. And I'm a compatibilist, so I don't care whether there's some indeterminism in there or anything else. So compatibilist views typically come in degrees. Now you overlay this caring view, or you combine it in some way with these other cognitive capacity views, and clearly the degrees can come apart, right? And you see that with young children, you see it with animals, you might see it with certain robots, that they could clearly have the capacities to be conscious and care more so than they have the other cognitive capacities. So that's just a long-winded way of saying I do believe it comes in degrees, but now I can't quite decide how to put it all together to figure out how to measure or consider those degrees when you're looking at the different features. Caring, the crucial other notion of caring in this, I mean, I'll have to look at Dreyfus and Heidegger to see how much they help. I'm kind of just drawing on my own intuitions, and then Harry Frankfurt, Shoemaker, and those theorists who talk about it as a type of motivational state, which is such that they put it in Frankfurtian terms. It's the most internal state to you, right? It feels like it's your identity in a way that other motivational states might not. You know, addictions, although of course ordinary language, you know, I care about having my cigarettes or my drugs, even if I'm addicted to them. So it's very hard to come up with the right analysis, but I think it's going to be something that comes in degrees, both the capacity to have it and the degree to which you care about various things. but also is something such that I, at least, would want not to attribute to beetles, even if I think beetles are conscious. I don't really think they care about their own survival. They're little robots. But when you get to other animals, I think you get the necessary kind of conscious motivational powers that I want to attribute to cares. I hope that helps a little bit.
So your notion of caring is related to a couple of other ideas, at least prevalent in neuroscience, one of which would be meaning, and then the issue of goals. And so many people regard robots and computer programs and ChatGPT and so forth as processing information. But we have to make a distinction between information and meaning. So to make that intuitive, information, according to Shannon, happens when there's a reduction in uncertainty. So if I ask you, do you like chocolate? That's yes or no, so that's one bit, and you answer yes or no. But actually, I don't care if you like chocolate. And so, in my node of the universe, in my edgy node in my whole universe of nodes, I'd update some little fact. But if you were a woman who I wanted to marry, and I ask you, will you marry me? And you say yes or no, that's also one bit. So the information is the same, but the meaning difference is hugely different, right? And in one case, I might be full of despair, and in the other case, I would be elated. So what's the difference? Well, in one case, I would have to update all kinds of nodes about my future, my ability to have children, create a family, or I'd have. So maybe we don't have a mathematics yet of meaning, but if we created one, it might look something like the number of nodes and subnodes that have to be updated within some kind of graph representation of the mind. But we don't have that yet. So right. So then there's meaning, and then how is meaning instantiated in brains? It's very much tied up with having goals that are subjectively experienced, like being thirsty, and then you have the goal of drinking. And there's a part of the brain, I'll talk about this a bit tomorrow, but causation in the brain is very circular. It's cybernetic. You have some kind of goal, and then you have some kind of error signal. Those error signals are typically experienced. So for example, as you're getting closer to your goal, you'll feel more or less of that error signal that you're trying to minimize, right? So an error signal might be pain, in which, if somebody sticks a knife into my thigh, I'm going to try to minimize that error signal to get back to my goal of feeling not pain. If I'm pushed off balance, I'll feel imbalance. I'll try to minimize that error signal. If I feel lonely, that's an error signal that I should socialize more. So all of these error signals actually, interestingly, lie along the anterior cingulate. So there's an area, Brodmann area 25, where the error signal is guilt and shame and embarrassment. And people who are depressed have a hyperactive area 25, so their error signal is wacky. It's not a coincidence, probably, that people who get OCD are treated with the same drugs as people who have depression, because in both cases there's a kind of sticky switch where you can't turn off that error signal. Now, if those error signals were not experienced, we wouldn't do anything. Like if you said, I have a toothache, but I don't feel any pain, you wouldn't go to the dentist. If you said, if you didn't feel lonely, you wouldn't try to socialize more, right? So then an interesting question is why these error signals evolved to be consciously experienced. I mean, intuitively, we wouldn't do anything if they weren't, right? If we didn't feel pleasure, we wouldn't seek more of it. If it didn't feel pain. But this is an open question, I think. The evolution of particular forms of error signals in a cybernetic causal loop.
So that's all really helpful to kind of highlight that there is a distinctive architecture in humans that, again, unless you're some kind of epiphenomenalist or a limitivist about the conscious feelings being essential in the processes, and it sounded like you were not going that route. You think the conscious experiences that the ACC gives you are kind of essential in humans, right, for motivating action. So there is this weird anthropomorphic feature of my view, and maybe your view about motivation, that says, yeah, you have to have that in order to have caring, in order to maybe have free will. But we know enough to know that there's going to be no lack of nodes in the chatbots. There's going to be no lack of ability to build a robotic system that can have goals on ordinary sense of that term, right? That are motivated in some sense to do what they do in ways that are, and maybe even to have the kind of, things that involve error signal theory and responding to that. So you're going to get all that without consciousness. And the question is, do we think that'll be sufficient if it's getting you everything that seems important about control and motivation and action, except meaning, if you think meaning requires consciousness, as I do? We should do more X-Fi on this. I don't know how much there's been, but I just find it incoherent to say that a completely dark on the inside entity, anything means anything to it. I mean, am I alone? Is that a widely shared intuition? Do y'all feel like it doesn't matter how much it's carrying out goals, it's doing complicated tasks, expressing emotional states even, if it's literally non-conscious, nothing means anything to it, nothing matters to it. Let's see a show of hands. How many people feel that way? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people don't feel that way? Okay. All right. Huh? Yeah. I don't know who's dark on the inside. Yeah. Hi.
Professor, first I would like to suggest to add Megan to that list of AI.
Okay.
It's a horror movie.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about it. I haven't
Yeah,
watched it.
she's great and very scary and shows the catastrophical way we're heading. And I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on phenomenal conscience, because I think I got the other one better.
Yeah, well, of course, it's notoriously poorly defined, right? Historically. I mean, it is, I think, what Descartes and many others think consciousness involves, but Nagel gives us what it's like to be a bat and says, it's the subjective experience from the animal or the human's point of view of the features of experiences like tasting a lemon, right? That specific taste it has when you, what's the drink we had a bunch of yesterday? That's lime, right? Cappuccino. Yeah. So that taste, that raw feel, that qualitative feature, which again, I'm not inclined to think that's the kind of sensory stuff is the important thing, but then the affective states of feeling sorrow, right? What it feels like to the agent who's suffering that. Again, we usually just gesture at it. We don't define it, but on the assumption that you're not dark on the inside, right? The problem of other minds looms, but on the assumption that you're not, we all assume other humans and most animals have this kind of internal light that is consciousness. And I think it's exactly that we think is crucial to get the robots over the edge. Does that help? Okay. I like the dark on the inside metaphor. I mean, I feel like we can kind of understand that when we talk to Claude or see a Roomba, or for me, see a beetle or an ant, right? Other people feel differently, but I know what it's like for them. Nothing. At least I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, as you were speaking, I was first of all, let me preface by saying I come at this from a lawyer's perspective, so I will doubtless be missing an awful lot from the philosopher's perspective here. But so, as you were speaking, and I was thinking about this this move to try to get at something by moving from the machine to get to free will. What capacities or experiences do we have to attribute to the machine to start to think it has free will? I started thinking about the reverse. Could it help? What if we start with the human being? what capacities specifically do we remove to get to the automaton? And I was thinking, are these symmetrical? What can we learn about the difficulty of going in both directions that might help here? Because you were talking about how hard it is to attribute P consciousness to a machine. And I was thinking about how hard it is to not attribute P consciousness to a human being. And so let me just take you through a couple of my thoughts here as I think about legal cases. So in some instances, and I, because I'm coming at this from a lawyer's perspective, I'm immediately moving to when we hold people responsible or not, because that's how it cashes out in legal systems. So some of these cases are very easy in terms of finding someone responsible. They lack rationality. They don't have access to the real facts. Okay, that's easy. Also very easy are the complete dissociation cases where people are automata. They are the automatism defense. They don't even have access consciousness. They just don't have any consciousness at all, we assume. But where
Can I just interrupt to say those are the kind of cases that people like Neil Levy and others are going to point to and say, access consciousness is why we think sleepwalkers aren't responsible.
Right. So I think you've put your finger on this in the role of emotion as being really interesting here, because as I think about the legal cases of removing emotional capacities from people, and at what point do our intuitions and treatment of them switch into non-responsibility, which might track some sense of free will, right? So we had this interesting case I've spoken to with some of my colleagues about in the last couple of years of a man with high-functioning autism spectrum disorder who killed a number of people, and the only defense available to him was that he lacked normal emotional function. And one of the forensic psychiatrists, this is reported in the case, was distinguishing between the psychopath and the person with ASD and said, the difference between them is the man with ASD lacks the capacity to understand emotion, but he cares. Whereas the psychopath has the capacity to understand emotion, but does not care. So there's a separation between emotional experience and the caring about things. So that I wonder what's meant there, because I think you're bringing the emotion always to go with the capacity to care is a function. It flows from the emotion. But here there's a suggestion, there's a disjunction between the two. Now the court didn't do anything useful with this. They just moved past that and said, oh yeah, that's of course right. The further question is, where do we get our capacity to care from if we're worrying about responsibility? But let's set that aside. And as we were continuing to talk, I was trying to think of examples to probe this problem of caring and emotion further. And so I want to give you a thought experiment. I'm going to be a little mini philosopher here. I don't know why. I have an intuition that's interesting. It doesn't cash out anywhere. So let's think of somebody with Capgras delusion who has emotions, cares, but is mistaken about the facts and so activates the wrong emotion. So what would we think about that person? Do they now have free will? If it's the emotional content and capacity are all present, they have P consciousness, they have emotional life, they care about things, but they're somehow caring about the wrong thing. Is that an easy case of delusion of non-rationality?
Yeah.
Or is that something else? Okay,
I mean,
that's my question.
so those are great cases to think about, and they remind me of the earlier question about the problem here that my account is separating kind of intuitive notions of free will and moral responsibility conditions. Now, it may be that for humans at least, and future robots, we're gonna think consciousness is essential, but we may not. I mean, we may think that consciousness is not relevant to legal responsibility or emotion or caring or anything like that, but it's the right kind of connection to reality and the right kind of understanding of the moral issues. So I think in the case of psychopaths, it's tricky also because psychopaths do care. They care about their own goals, and I think they care emotionally and consciously. At least my understanding of them. Y'all can correct. They just don't care about others, right? And the autistic, I think where the autistic person may care about others, but not have the right emotional motivations, but they usually do. But that's consistent with the idea that we can act in lots of ways to accord with social or legal norms without caring about doing so, right? We're doing it for practical reasons or whatever. So anyway, it's a muddle because the free will account that I'm describing doesn't map onto responsibility directly. It may shed some light in interesting cases, but I haven't figured that out yet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk, Eddy.
Edgy. It's edgy.
Edgy, okay. It gave me a lot of food for thought. But the entire time I was thinking, isn't it possible to just flip your argument upside down? And doesn't that bite you, back? Because, I mean, if you argue that we can imagine computer robots being so complicated and, as to attribute free will to them, in the same line, couldn't we do the other way around, complicated robots that do present complicated behavior and all this stuff, don't they show that we are not so free will after all? We don't have so much free will after all. And that, it's kind of a narcissistic wound, Don't this can be used for the argument on the other way around, Is that clear?
Here's what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say, can't somebody just use this, like philosophers always do, as a reductio, right? And say, why wouldn't we instead just say, you can have, these complicated robots that, the way Christian List and Dan Dennett are thinking, that if they're sophisticated enough and they're carrying out the right capacities, maybe even to be legally responsible, then we should say they have free will. But that's not what you were saying. You were doing it something about limiting our free will isn't going to be as much as we thought because what? Because we don't actually care as much as we thought. Yeah. Oh, I don't care about that. So I hope it's clear from my view that I'm a naturalist about all this. I have a slide about what I think it would take to build robots that satisfy these criteria. I think they're going to have to be embodied in the real world or in a matrix world and I think Dreyfus and Heidegger would agree with that. You've got to have sort of real world connections. You're going to have to build the motivations, not, in such a way that at some point you're feeling the motivation one way or the other. But I think there's nothing in principle that makes that impossible for us to do with future robots. It may be practically impossible. It may be something that we're smart enough to avoid for various reasons, but yeah. But I definitely don't see the possibility as having any negative effects on our own sense of free will. At least I don't, but we can talk about it more.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Raquel. I also have a name in English, which is Raquel.
Which is what?
Raquel.
Okay.
So actually my question is, what's the difference between robot and machine? How can we know the difference?
Between a robot and a machine?
Yes. I have this story I tell everywhere I go. I have a heart disease, and because of this heart disease, I have a machine inside of me. So how can I know? Because I was wondering, so I have a robot inside of me. So what's the difference between machine and robot?
Right. So the short answer is maybe nothing. I think whatever you have inside of you, hopefully for a very long time, will carry out the functional properties that are required of whatever biological system they're replacing. And I think we might be able to do that with other machines in the future that could functionally replicate whatever our brains are doing in the ACC and elsewhere to replicate conscious experience and caring and all that. I find that completely conceivable, unless there's something really weird about the biology of neurons, and there might be, that we're just not going to be able to do with machine replication. And it may be too expensive, so there's all kinds of things that might make it impossible. But by machine, all I mean is non-biological, although that gets tricky too. At some point, we're going to create things that might be able to replicate and have metabolisms, and so why aren't they biological?
BCIs.
Yeah, so it might just be kind of and then there's a whole nother question about, does it have to have the right sort of history, evolutionarily or developmentally, in order to count as having the right capacities for for an artificial heart or whatever it is? You don't need the history. Who cares, right? If it's carrying out the function. But there are many people who have argued that in order to have consciousness or certain types of mental states like intentionality, you have to develop both historically as a biological or artificial organism, or have the right evolutionary history. So there's all kinds of philosophical issues here that I'm very interested in, but I'm just trying to here are the criteria you would have to meet in order to get what I think you would need to have a true attribution of free will. I hope that helped a little.
Well, a big round of applause for Mr. Eddy Nahmias. We come back